So, as discussed in the first video in this 4-part series, my main criticism of ContraPoints was the way in which he handled the Buck Angel situation, specifically the way in which he defended his domestic abuse. However, certain people were not happy with my criticism of the Queen and subsequently set out to target me, trying desperately to force me into remaining silent. Enter Xanderhal, self-declared trans ally and serial abuser of trans folk, who went so far as to use my history as a survivor of domestic abuse to argue that I, in turn, must be an abuser. Though before we can discuss that, I just need to give a content warning for the following: transphobia, ambiphobia, ableism, domestic abuse, child rape, mutilation, and cults. Following my criticism of Natalie, Xanderhal came out of nowhere and made a series of accusations about me, including the assertion that I hadn't watched all of Natalie's video before responding. This is in spite of the fact that I'd been posting updates as I dismantled the entire thing to make sure what I said in one video wouldn't be contradicted later on. On top of this, Xanderhal heard me explain how my third video would cover content that came after the point I had allegedly stopped watching at. For example, I said the third video would cover how Natalie pretends she's speaking out about cancelling to stick up for the underdogs who suffer relentless abuse, only to direct her audience to hate bomb her non-binary critics who she insinuates are secretly Nazis. When people call Xanderhal out on all of this, he rather infamously blames said lies on his busted AC, while still asserting he told the truth. Somehow. He also claimed my criticism of Natalie was in bad faith. Now, what exactly he means by this is never made clear. He never shows evidence of me having an ulterior motive. So it seems it's just a phrase he's learnt to regurgitate when he doesn't have an argument. Speaking of being void of argument, Xanderhal never made it past the introduction of my video, rather conveniently cutting it off just before I showed evidence of how much I used to look up to Natalie so people understood exactly where I came from. Xanderhal never dealt with any of the actual points I made, instead pretending as if responding to my opening was enough. Now, all of this is covered in a wonderful video put together by Levi, who, full disclosure, is now editor for this channel. And whilst there was a lot I wanted to say on the matter at the time, I still didn't produce my own, instead posting a couple things to Twitter and leaving it at that. Contrary to the claims made by those in support of abuse culture, I don't go looking for a fight, because, frankly, his efforts were pretty pathetic. I mean, blaming your lies on your busted AC in the dead of winter? Who does that? Fast forward 2 months and I come to learn that, during that time, Xanderhal has gone on to target no less than 6 other trans folk, most of whom were non-binary, with a couple being non-binary supportive. I could no longer ignore him. Xanderhal lying about me had been one thing, but when I found him systematically targeting multiple trans people, I felt I had to speak up, and so I did. Xanderhal responded by targeting my mental health, going so far as to state that, quote, "It's a well-known fact that EOT is legitimately an abusive piece of shit with mental issues. I hope they seek professional help so they can get better and improve their life. It can't be healthy to live like that." End quote. And yeah, I do have mental health problems. As someone who was abused as a minor, I suffer from PTSD, something I'm seeing a therapist for. And contrary to what people like Xanderhal like to imply, my therapist's response was not to try and police my emotions and justify Xanderhal's abuse. Instead, they helped me walk through my reasons for taking a stand, namely to ensure the safety of my community, both for others and for myself. Being marginalized, people are denied the support they need from general society, which is exactly why we form smaller communities. Because it's important for us to have a secure place we can come back to, receive mental health support, get advice on how to handle day-to-day life, everything cis people take for granted. But when abusive people like Xanderhal are allowed to force themselves into these spaces and target their members without repercussion, they stop being safe. The end result of which is many trans people are stripped of potentially life-saving support. And so from there, my therapist explained that the actions of people like Xanderhal didn't seem to be motivated by a genuine concern for my health. Rather the opposite. These seem to be methods designed to disable the defenses of marginalized individuals that people like Xanderhal feed off of. Similar to how certain parasites inject anesthetic to ensure their victims remain unresponsive to their presence. And in typical Xanderhal fashion, he went on to prove just how little he cared about my well-being by escalating the abuse until Levi and I hosted a 2-hour stream, detailing as much of the transphobic and ableist abuse as we could. Now, one of the core points of that stream was an explanation as to how Xanderhal's ableism is wrong, not only on account of being ableist, but also on account of being transphobic due to the specific social context. A lot of transphobia is predicated on the idea that we're all mentally ill and thus dangerous. People assigned male at birth are most often presented as deranged men just waiting for the next opportunity to assault innocent women and children, whilst people assigned female at birth are most often presented as deluded lesbians indoctrinated into a self-mutilating cult. These are the two largest narratives used to strip us of our human rights. So when Xanderhal resorts to ableism anytime a trans person is critical of him or the people he idolizes, that feeds into society's reservoir of anti-trans prejudice, making his behaviour double up as transphobic abuse. Though this goes beyond his own actions. The day after I'd publicly received a threat of violence on his behalf, Xanderhal had to block a load of trans people he'd gone after out of fear of being flagged for hate and harassment. But he couldn't do this without telling his fans that he loved to see them, quote, tear them apart, end quote. Xanderhal was encouraging his fans to abuse trans people, in full knowledge of the facts that this went against terms of service and that some of us had already been threatened by his fans. So we brought this along with another 2 hours worth of evidence and we discussed it in detail, explaining why all of this is completely unacceptable. Xanderhal, being the spoiled brat he is, could not deal with our criticism. Which brings us to the main topic of today's video, the way in which Xanderhal still abuses victims of domestic abuse for profit. Now I'm going to play you 3 clips from a stream, of which there's an archive copy linked below for context. The total of the clips are a little on the long side, coming to about 8 minutes, but I feel you need to see them in their entirety to get the true impact of what he was trying to do.
When I say Essence of Thought has an abusive personality disorder, I'm not saying that people with personality disorders are abusive. Use your ears, chat. I say this in the best faith, but let's not ascribe personality disorders to shitty people. I haven't done that. Have I actually done that? Feels like armchair psychology. It is armchair psychology. I'm not a psychologist. It is by definition armchair psychology. However, from the research that I've done, I feel somewhat like I can speak authoritatively on this. The best would probably to say they probably have a disorder and they are abusive. That's basically my, they definitely are abusive. And they've admitted to having disorders. I mean, either way. Is there anything else that we want to cover? Do we have like any of, I think there's one more. Don't do armchair psychology. Listen, armchair psychology is usually a bad thing, but I feel I've done enough research and I've had enough personal experience in this situation to be able to speak somewhat authoritatively on this. Yeah, no, I've dealt with abuse in the past. I know how it affects you, and I've done enough research on the cycle of abuse to know that there's probably a good chance that Essence of Thought's abuse, which they've alluded to, probably has affected their current mental state. I really don't think that is like a bad take.
When I saw Piggy going for more people, that's when I stepped up. because it was impacting the community as a whole. And I couldn't.
Okay, no, it wasn't. Literally, all of my fans were like backing me up, and there were like 5 people that were going after me. Just say Nazis suck more. Nazis do suck. God damn. Armchair psychology is cringe. Okay, you know what, guys? If you guys really fucking hate armchair psychology, I will abstain from the armchair psychology then, alright? Fuck it. I apologize, chat. Jesus Christ. God damn. Now I can't post this on YouTube because Essence of Thought's gonna clip that and be like, ha! Even Xanderhal's own audience agrees with me. Good job, chat. Nice. Because I've known more than one person with it and only one of them was a violent person, dipshit. Wait, what? Violent? Wait, what are you talking about? I haven't accused Essence of Thought being violent? Oh, you were talking to someone else. Okay, alright. Okay. Now, I think my main point... Hold on. Can I, like... Emily, just ban them. If they're a ban evader, just ban them. Okay. Can I try to rephrase my position in the most concise way possible so you guys understand what I'm talking about here? Because I feel like my take isn't very controversial and there's just a miscommunication happening. Can I try to do that very quickly? Can I do that really quick? I'm going to bring out paint, all right? All right. So there is a thing, very well documented, I believe, called the cycle of abuse, okay? So let's say you're like a little child, okay? And you get abused when you're a kid, right? You know, this is you, little kid, right? And you get a, you know, let's say this is like a hand slapping him across the face, right? Boom, you're getting abused when you're a kid, okay? Sucks. Terrible. Bad. Very not good, okay? Are you a psychologist, Xanderhal? Yes. So, let's say you grow up and you get abused. Is it unreasonable? I know it, listen, I know it's armchair psychology, okay? But I feel like this is something most people that have done a bit of research can authoritatively have an opinion on, alright? Let's say you get abused when you're growing up. Do you think it is unreasonable to say... I use brush, yeah. Do you think it is unreasonable to make the case that this can result in some mental health issues as you get older? I know it did for me. No. I'm not making an argument here. I'm literally just asking chat their opinion on this, okay? I'm asking chat for their opinion on this. Do you think it is unreasonable to say that if you were abused when you were younger, when you get older, you have a higher likelihood of having mental illnesses? Sure, but it's not a personality disorder. A personality disorder... Oh, wait, hold on. I actually have a question, chat. Just stop. I'm literally... Oh my god. Chat. I'm trying to learn from you. I'm actually curious and trying to learn from you, chat. Can you please educate me on this instead of just saying, just stop, dude? Can you please? Please. Please, chat. I love you all. Stop just saying, just stop. And help me out here, okay? I'm curious. Are personality disorders, and this is a genuine question, I want to know if anybody who has, like, can speak authoritatively on this. Is there a classification for personality disorders that is, you're coming off more? No, I'm asking genuine questions. These aren't leading questions. Is there, because I want you guys to like point out where I go wrong here, okay? So, are personality disorders classified as like a mental illness? A personality disorder is a type of mental disorder in which you have a rigid and unhealthy pattern of thinking, functioning, and behaving. A person with a personality disorder has trouble perceiving and relating to situations and people. Yeah, I don't disagree with that. Just to admit the disorder part where you say abusive personality. Well, yeah, they definitely have abusive personality. That's definitely true. Maybe that's just like the wording that I have here. I'm assuming that their abusive personality is attributed to some disorder, maybe? Could that be the meme? That could probably be the issue here. I mean, I know, like, they admit to having some form of mental illness, and they have abusive personality. Maybe that's where the miscommunication is happening here. Wait, chat, is that where the miscommunication is happening here? Okay, I think we're good. I should clarify. I don't think that the reason that they are abusive, entirely at least, is because of their abusive personality or their mental health issues, okay? I think that it's definitely a part of it. However, I don't think abusive personality disorder is a thing. They have mental health issues and an abusive personality, which can be mutually exclusive. For all I know, their abusive personality is unrelated to their mental health issues. It's very possible. I don't know. Okay, good. I'm glad we cleared that up. I'm glad we cleared up the miscommunication. Well, no, it was a miscommunication, Emily. It's because of my wording that people had an issue with. It's like when I used to say gender dysmorphia when I first started streaming. Oh, no. Who was around for that? Was anyone around back when I first started streaming and I used to accidentally say gender dysmorphia?
This act is not simply repugnant, but violent. Xanderhal's line of argument here is an attempt to strip me of my autonomy, forwarding my criticism of his transphobia and ableism as being predetermined by the horrific events of my childhood. This is what victims of abuse are referring to when we say we don't want to be defined by our trauma. We're not saying we never want to discuss what happened and the pervasive ways it has impacted us, but rather that not every part of our life has to be linked back to said point in our histories. When Xander declares that my actions today are a direct result of what happened to me as a child, he is stripping me of my choice, my will, all whilst dragging me back to that point in time. On top of that, this is Xanderhal asserting that I lack the ability to perceive and judge when something is harmful to me. This is him attempting to erode my ability to self-advocate, to take steps to protect not just those around me, but myself. This is gaslighting in the purest form, the very same sort used by domestic abusers. Through both of these things, Xanderhal is re-victimizing me, the impact of which is tangible harm. When I hear Xanderhal make this argument, it hurts. My anxiety spikes, my chest cramps, and I just want to delete everything I have ever put out that mentions what I went through as a child, just to spare me the possibility of someone else weaponizing my trauma against me. Xanderhal is exploiting the most traumatic moments of my life to assassinate my character, all to win an internet argument. Xanderhal violated me when he did that, causing irreparable damage to my psyche as he did. He took something with extreme reverence and exploited it to enable his abusive mind games. And let's not forget how he knows about my history as a survivor of abuse in the first place. I chose to share that history on my channel to open up and discuss the fact that I was abused as a child and later on raped inside the domestic violence refuge to help others. For a good part of a decade, I have shared a very difficult part of my life to try and reach out to others who have been through or are going through similar situations, to let them know that they're not alone and that they're not lesser because of the actions of someone else. That is the work I have done on this channel. That is what Xanderhal decided to drive his ego through, all because he couldn't handle criticism of his transphobic and ableist behaviour. Sadly, I'm not the only person Xanderhal has hurt in this way. He did this to another trans person. social justice demon, only a short while before he did it to me. And regardless of your personal experience or thoughts on social justice demon, he did not deserve to have his history as a survivor of abuse weaponized against him either. As for Xanderhal's claims to be genuinely curious, even his own audience could tell that was a lie, that he wasn't just asking. These were leading questions intended to guide the audience to the conclusion he wanted them to back him up on, only for him to desperately bail, pretending they'd actually meant to say something else when it all backfired. This shows malice in place of simple thoughtlessness. He was trying to weaponize my childhood trauma, and he knew it. Not that this line of discussion would be acceptable even if it were genuine curiosity. Xanderhal does not have the right to speculate on the ways in which my childhood trauma has impacted me. It is such a volatile topic with high potential to be exploited in an abusive fashion that you just do not go there. There are some things we just shouldn't do, and this was one of them. This line of argumentation also doesn't make sense from an intellectual standpoint. It's not only possible, but far easier to criticize someone as wrong or abusive by discussing their present behavior as opposed to speculating about their past trauma. If my past were affecting my behavior in the present, those patterns would be apparent regardless of the cause. And yet, not once does Xanderhal stop to go, here, look at this. This is why I think Ethel is abusive. A side effect of which is that all this trivializes the pain victims of abuse go through. Xanderhal labels any criticism of him as abusive without so much as a mention as to how, implying that abuse amounts to little more than disagreeing with him. That's why, when I say Xander's actions are ableist and transphobic, I explain how his actions reinforce prejudice and advocate violence towards the disabled, neurodivergent, and trans communities. I don't want to trivialize such matters by making wild claims without evidence. Xanderhal, meanwhile, uses such assertions to declare my criticism as something that should be ignored or dismissed outright. And to argue this, he brings up the facts that I am a survivor of abuse alongside the cycle of violence, the way in which violence can manifest across generations. Xanderhal does this with the intent of declaring me to have an abusive personality disorder. And all this is reliant on a simple semantic trick, changing the statement victims of abuse are more likely to display abusive behaviors to victims of abuse are likely to display abusive behaviors. Now, it's easier to explain the difference if we use numbers. Say that hypothetically, 1% of all people become abusers, but that number increases to 2% for victims of childhood abuse. That would be a significant increase of double the likelihood of abusive behavior in victims of childhood abuse. Based on that, it would be fair to say that victims of abuse are more likely to display abusive behaviors. But does that 2% risk mean that victims of abuse are likely to become abusers? Of course not. That should be ignoring 98% of all cases. So by dropping a single word, Xanderhal can assert that I must be an abuser by virtue of probability. Yet, he can acknowledge his own history of abuse whilst being spared any such scrutiny. Because that's how cis privilege works. Interesting thing to note here, Xanderhal incorrectly calls the cross-generational cycle of violence the cycle of abuse, a completely different model that deals with how abusers ensnare their victims by following violent outbursts with sudden displays of affection. This is a red flag that suggests Xanderhal should not be talking on the subject of domestic abuse. On a similar note, there is no such thing as an abusive personality disorder. at least not in psychology. You can't just take random traits and declare it as a type of personality disorder. These are established conditions with specific diagnostic criteria. The DSM-5 divides their disorders into 3 clusters, with cluster A containing paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal personality disorders, cluster B containing antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic personality disorders, and cluster C containing avoidant, dependent, and obsessive-compulsive personality disorders, none of which are the so-called abusive personality disorder mentioned. So for Xanderhal to repeatedly use the term whilst claiming to have done enough research to speak authoritatively on the topic shows us that he's lying somewhere. He's either lying about personality disorders or he's lying about having done the research. Either way, not good. What's more is, it wouldn't matter if Xanderhal was a psychologist. Armchair psychology is not only bad when the untrained do it, it's actually a violation of ethical conduct when a professional does it. That's why the American Psychological Association has what is known as the Goldwater Rule, under Section 7 of its Principles of Medical Ethics, with said rule reading as quote, "On occasion, psychiatrists are asked for an opinion about an individual who is in light of public attention or who has disclosed information about himself/herself through public media. In such circumstances, a psychiatrist may share with the public his or her expertise about psychiatric issues in general. However, it is unethical for a psychiatrist to offer a professional opinion unless he or she has conducted an examination and has been granted proper authorization for such a statement." End quote. The only time a professional is usually allowed to speculate on such things is once an individual is dead, and that's due to the limiting effect death has on the harm the psychiatrist can inflict through their speculation. This isn't an issue of Xanderhal failing to be an accredited psychologist. Armchair psychology is unethical for anyone to partake in. Now, his actions throughout this may lead one to question, why did he do this? Well, I think the intent is pretty clear. For a start, Xanderhal sought to inflict as much psychological harm as possible in hopes that it forced me to stay silent. We know Xanderhal encourages his fans to abuse trans people who criticize his behavior. We know he was not asking genuine questions, but was rather acting out of clear malice. Xanderhal likes to hurt people, especially his trans critics. And it's easy for him to do since who's going to call him out? The far right? The left he pretends to be a part of that has historically failed marginalized groups time and time again, being riddled with centrists and the self-termed dirtbag left? It's a minimum risk strategy that has only come into trouble recently with a paradigm shift across the entire trans community about the way certain people exploit the trauma of others for content. More on that in the video about Riley Grace Rochon. I mean, even failing bludgeoning me into silence, Xanderhal could still poison the well against me. If he can write off every criticism of him as being the bad faith ramblings of someone with an abusive personality disorder, he can shut down criticism from trans people at any point. Because trans people, as a marginalized demographic, are more likely than cis people to be victims of violence and abuse, not to mention suffer mental health problems as a result. It's the perfect argument. Pragmatically, ethically and intellectually, well, I hope I've shown how it falls apart there. Now, some people might argue that Xanderhal recanted near the end of the clips I showed. Indeed, that's an argument Riley Grace Rochon made in her video, "What is Bigotry?" arguing that since bigotry requires an unwillingness to change and Xanderhal can change, he therefore cannot be a bigot. My response to which, rather ironically, is to show you Riley's evidence of just how Xanderhal has changed.
So what happened was that I ended up having a conversation with Xanderhal, all right? And we ended up having a conversation basically to the effect of the issues I have talked about so far. And I wanted to ask him specifically about his intent for why he made the arguments that he did. And this is a clip where he talks specifically about that. I'm going to let it play. I'm not going to interrupt. I'm not going to mince his words. I'm going to let him just say his piece, and then we'll resume the conversation. The thing that I take issue with is like taking that to imply some sort of mental defect or disease, right? Like that seems like sort of a non sequitur. It's that like as far as your argument goes, it does not necessarily seem to be like I don't understand the necessity to connect that to like a mental defect or disease. Like it seems both unnecessary for your argument. Like you don't need to make it for your merits. You can just say that Essence of Thought, if they did that, is a bad person. I don't see why trying to imply some sort like something beyond that is necessary for you.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the things I regret about my my covering of Essence of Thought is that I don't feel like I did the best job of like covering myself on the ableism claim. My claim was never that like Essence of Thought has some sort of mental condition that makes them act the way that they do, and so that is why they engage in the bad faith abusive behavior that they do. My take was more so that people who, and I think you'll agree with this, I don't think this, like you need to agree with this. Generally, if you grow up in a fucked situation, there's a high likelihood that you're going to go through your life believing that that kind of behavior is acceptable, right? So if you have like abusive parents that like lashed out and hit you when you were a kid, whenever you did something wrong, you may grow up thinking that it's acceptable to hit somebody or get violent if that's what you're in. That doesn't mean you have any type of mental condition, but it is an explanation or a possible reason for why you think it would be appropriate to behave in that way. And I feel like that's probably what happened with Essence of Thought. I guess it's armchair psychology, but just from my experience, that was my assumption. Just because Essence of Thought has talked about how they've been abused in their life, and yeah, it just seemed like a reasonable conclusion to come to.
Twice in a row. I'm sorry. I'm really trying my best. It's also very late and I've had a long week. But anyway, no time for excuses. Let's get going. So in case you did not hear, effectively what Xanderhal said was this, right? That Xanderhal was not trying to talk so much about Essence of Thought having any sort of mental disease, but just that Essence of Thought, because they had certain mental issues that Essence of Thought has talked about before, and that this Essence of Thought has been the victim of abuse from a younger age, then that would make it more likely that Essence of Thought would become an abuser later on, right?
So, the same ableist shit as before with zero change. Now, we'll return to Riley and her gaslighting in part 4 of this series, but I felt this clip, chosen by Riley herself, so nobody can accuse me of taking anything out of context, shows that Xander has not learned anything from his experience. Xanderhal is still using the fact that I am a survivor of domestic abuse to assert that I must have an abusive personality. And I get that he claims this to be an explanation rather than an argument. But the problem with that is, an explanation of what? This is Xanderhal's sole piece of evidence that I am an abuser. He has nothing to explain. So it's very clear that he's refusing to let go of the ableist and transphobic character assassination discussed earlier, but wants to pretend otherwise. And yes, this is still ableist, even if the person who refers to mental illness as mental disease and defect refuses to acknowledge that fact. Yet perhaps more importantly, this demonstrates that neither Riley nor Xanderhal understand the main issue. The ableism present is nothing new. We'd already established that Xanderhal is an abusive bigot conclusively. What took this case to an entirely different level is that exploitation of my history as a survivor. Because even if he had other evidence of abuse, that still would not justify making such a connection. Nobody, not Xanderhal, not Riley, not a trained psychiatrist, nobody has the right to drag my advocacy for other victims of domestic violence into debate to exploit as part of their argument. And it is disgusting for anyone to sit there, grinning, asserting otherwise. And before we end, can we please acknowledge how Xanderhal is dragging out my history as a survivor of domestic abuse whilst he plays a video game? he fails to so much as pause for a few minutes and focus on the topic to show even the most basic iota of respect for the most painful experiences I have ever survived. I seriously cannot overstate just how enraged his crass behaviour makes me feel. Yes, that ableism and transphobia are bad in their own right, but this is downright cruel. Of course, Xanderhal is only a small part in a much, much larger abuse culture. So be sure to join me in the next video as we go on to discuss Luxembourg and how they encouraged Xanderhal as he was doing all this, feeding Xanderhal's ego and teaching him that he had the right to exploit the trauma of trans folk. After that, we can finally move on to tackling Riley's callous behaviour. If you have any questions or criticisms, do post them below. Just know that abuse won't make it through. If you appreciate what we do here on the channel, do know that you can support us via Patreon. We no longer monetize our videos, meaning that Patreon is the sole source of income for the channel, allowing us to keep it running. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following patrons: Hannah Banghart, Matthew Kovac, Soraya Katie, Gerhard Van Vorst, Steve Corbin, Sosh Daniels, and Justin Allen. And for myself, Adita and Levi, take care now.